this is the Coffee campus of Monash University, but Monash was actually established in Creighton, which is a bit further out. And people talk about geography, environmental sciences, that I mentioned to you, are actually Creighton. That's probably also why sometimes they could be considered another faculty. So I would like obviously to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. John Tuckwell, who comes from the delegation of the European Union in Canberra, and who's very kindly agreed to relieve me of the task of having to explain to you the common agricultural policy, how it has changed, how it is changing, because it is still changing, and what it actually means. Now, John explained to me that he's been in Australia since the late 1980s as an advisor. He's got a background as an agricultural economist, is that right, John? Yep. And now works for the Trade Economics and Agriculture Division of the Delegation of the European Union in Canberra as a senior advisor. So we agreed, I had the pleasure of having lunch with John, we agreed that because it's very technical, right, and some of you may not have the background, and it's a very small group, apologies, that we would make it interactive, right, which means that at any point, if you so wish, raise your hand, right, if you require clarification, right? And John will decide if he wants to explain this now, or to say, well, look, I can't explain it now, I will have to explain something else, and then I'll come back to it, right? This way I think you'll get the most out of it, because it's highly technical at times, I would think, right? And as we also discussed, there's a lot of jargon. I think that, you started to get used to the jargon that is associated with the European Union, the acronyms and all the rest of it. But sometimes it's very challenging, right? So you may need certain clarifications about certain terms that John may sort of, use like this, without even thinking twice, right? But that we may in fact find obscure, right? So could you please join me in welcoming John and thanking him, right? Agricultural policy. And I hand over to you. If you could now switch on your microphone.
Switch it on.
Yeah. Press the slide the lever on. Oh, it's on. It's actually on.
It's on?
Okay,
It's working?
So let's go.
All right. Technology. Anyway, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to Monash, so it's a bit of a venture for me to come this one out. But at least I can see this is Monash is catching up with Canberra. You're trying to ban plastic bags. But anyway, so what I'm going to try and do is fairly high level. I won't get too much into detail. I may dip a couple of times just to try and do some illustrations about the common agricultural policy, but I'll try and keep to a high level. I would make an observation that at the outset that the CAP, and there's an acronym already, the Common Agricultural Policy, is a fertile ground in Australia for academic study. We're about doing their masters in it, and most of it is looking at the negative side of the CAP and the impact it's had on Australian agriculture and on world agriculture. And so much so, if I can actually use this technology, I would say that a common way of looking at Europe is EU equals CAP equals ban. And of course that is wrong. But I would say that, wouldn't I, where I am. But what I do hope to show you that in what is actually the 50th anniversary of the Common Agricultural Policy this year, that this well-trodden thorough, to keep on using these farming analogies, of criticising the CAP is only really relevant from a historical point of view. The contemporary CAP is very different indeed. That's one of my key messages today. In fact, what I would say now is the CAP is all about trying to have vibrant rural communities. And that, as an objective, is something which Australian agriculture is trying to achieve. There is a huge now amount of commonality about what agriculture is trying to get to. So that's a sort of a light-hearted way to start with to get some core messages. So first thing we get into, talk about the evolution of CAP, then quickly where the budget side of the CAP into the new reforms, and then what has this meant, these changes for Australia. So, attempt of a brief history. So we start with the early years of the CAP. Of course, the European Economic Community, the Treaty of Rome, 1957, established the framework by which a CAP could be established. It took a number of years. It was in 14th of January 1962 that the treaties, the CAP was agreed. It wasn't implemented to the middle of that year, so it goes back 50 years. And if you look at the context at that time, we're talking about immediate post-war, where the agricultural industry in Europe was, to a large extent, crippled by warfare, and the supply of food was very uncertain. Certainly, just to age myself a bit, rationing had just ended just before I was born at that time. So you're talking about, this is the context of which the CAP was born. So, not a surprise, one of the first considerations was food security. Whilst it's not explicitly set out in the documents, food security is underpinning. One way of achieving food security is improve the productivity of agriculture, because that's very much a fundamental way we look at it. Markets at that time, the agricultural markets, needed to be some stabilisation. There was a great variation, and also the incomes in rural areas, there was a great disparity between those and urban areas. So there was a degree of desire under the broad policy objectives to support income. How they chose to do this was to have high internal prices in Europe. And how did they achieve that? They put large tariffs on imports. They took, if the markets were imbalanced, they took excess supply off the market, either through what we call intervention buying, which is permanently taking off the market, or through what's called private storage aids, which is temporary in a cycle. You just take them off for, say, 6 months, put them back on the market. That works fine until you start to create the infamous butter mountains and wine lakes. Then you have to dispose of those services onto the world market. You use export subsidies because of the difference between the high prices within Europe and the low world prices. So that was the method which was used to support agriculture. Funny enough, if you give farmers incentives through higher prices, couple that with a time, this is the time of what was called the Green Revolution. New varieties of crops were coming through, which responded enormously to fertilizer and chemicals, and the productivity of agriculture went through the roof. As a result, you led to overproduction. To dispose of those surpluses, because the essential having high prices means consumers pay for the support, not the taxpayer. Because you have high prices, you pay for it. If it's on that one as well. If you have a support which is just giving money to farmers, the taxpayers be paying. But even that, with high prices, the cost of the CAP was exploding and was unsustainable. The friction was caused by disposing of the surpluses onto the world market were very large and very significant, and led to, in Australia, the formation of the Keynes Group in 1986, which was a direct response to disposal of EU surplus production into the world market. And we're talking about here what we were calling then structural surpluses. They're not annual up and down occasional surpluses. These were ones which were permanently there and permanently had surpluses to dispose of. During this period of this, we're talking about here, the 70s, 80s, numerous attempts to make proposals to change this. We had many too many farmers trying to, I read some documents were saying that the proposal was trying to reduce the number of farmers by 5 million. These proposals were made, the European Commission may have made the proposals, the member states who make the decisions weren't prepared to make such radical decisions, so that we're in a situation, all the best we really got some structural adjustment measures to encourage older farmers to leave and newer farmers to come in. So it really didn't address. We have something in Europe. We had a number of quota systems, something called milk quotas. They were introduced in 1984. We have a system we call set aside, where you, in arable production, you put 10% of your land out of production to try and reduce the amount you produce, and you get paid for set aside. That was introduced in 1988. So at this stage, we had some measures which tried to address the structural surplus we had, but they really didn't do what was intended to. It wasn't until 1992, what's also known as the McSharry reforms, did we actually really start to address the issue. The McSharry reforms were very significant. They led to what's called the Uruguay round outcome of the GATT negotiations at that time and the formation of the World Trade Organizations. Without these reforms, there would not have been a Uruguay round. So these were very significant in trade terms, although the driver was budget stabilization. It was the main driver always in Europe has been the budget rather than international pressure. Because international pressure was important, but it was the domestic considerations which were dominant. How it was addressed at that time was significant cuts in guaranteed prices, and when I mean significant, we're talking about in the order of 35% for cereals, 15% for beef, cuts in prices. So quite significant. They were partially compensated by introduction of what we call headage payments and area payments. So there were compensations. So people started to produce for those subsidies, kept more sheep on their farm because they got more subsidies. So that was one of the unforeseen impacts. As I said, budget stabilization was key. We strengthened very much our environmental policies at that time. The increased intensity of agriculture started to take effect on the quality of water and biodiversity. And instead of trying to support income, we started to look to stabilize income. That was 1992. In 1999, in what we call the Agenda 2000 reforms, which were really setting up Europe for enlargement with the Eastern and Central European countries, which were coming from a much lower level of agricultural development, none of the subsidies, so that had to be adjusted to allow for that transition. What we did then, we deepened the reform process further, we reduced the intervention prices so that they were really just operating as a safety net. And that in itself, by lowering the prices, improved the international competitiveness. We started, at that time, here's a bit of jargon, we have now two pillars of the CAP. And Europe loves pillars. Not often when you talk about institutes, but this pillar, that pillar, anything else. But CAP has two pillars, the market pillar and the rural development pillar. And this is all about supporting the rural community as a whole, not just agriculture. We strengthen our environmental measures further, and quality. It was about that time when we really came to the realization that Europe could not compete on the bulk commodities against Brazil and Australia of the world. Europe's future lie in quality products and differentiating products from through things like geographical indications and the like, by means of showing that individual products are different and getting a price premium. So this was a further step, and built into that, because reform has sort of got ingrained in the CAP, that required there to be a mid-term review. That started in mid-2003, mid-term review started in 2003. It was really a rolling set of reforms through into 2007, which looked at particular commodities which were in surplus. Rice was one, and the olive industry was another important one, and the dairy industry later. And these were the fundamental aspect about this was not so much the increased market orientation by addressing these commodities, which were still in possible structural surplus, but something which we call decoupling. This jargon means that the support received is no longer tied to production. It's decoupled from production. So it's no longer hedged for area payments. It's no longer on the end price. It is a payment made regardless of what you do on your farm. So this payment, called single farm payment, single payment scheme, changed its name over time, is paid to producers either on the basis of historically what they used to receive through these area and headage payments, or on an average for a region, or as a combination of two. And the significance of this is that the producers now produce for the market, they do not produce for subsidies. So this is a direct payment to them. There's still some controversy about the level of them, but it's a substantial change, and it's one of the key changes which have meant that the CAP is off the international agenda as far as trade concerns are concerned. Consumer concerns started increasingly to become into apparent. These are partly about environmental degradation, it's partly about animal welfare, it's partly about the health scares we have, the whole mad cow disease, about salmonella in eggs, and a number of other dioxin problems. All these added to the fact that consumers started to lose confidence in agriculture. And what has evolved is almost a social contract between the society as a whole and the agricultural industry, in that there's now a whole set of conditions on agriculture which they have to meet to be able to receive
John,
the subsidies.
could you take a minute to explain the mad cow business? Because
Mad cows.
I'm pretty sure that everybody
Maybe you
knows what it's
too.
referring to.
I can't give blood because of mad cow disease in this country. Mad cow disease is BSE. I can't say what it is, and it has transmitted from cows into humans through CBD variant. This is a disease of the brain, and at that time they thought there would be large numbers of humans going down with CJD variant. And so it was caused by cows being fed cows, basically. It's using bone meal to be in the feed was the cause. And so since then has been introduced a huge range of measures prohibiting feeding of bone and meat meal, controls, slaughtering out any animal which has this disease. So we have not, thankfully, had this huge outbreak of mortality on it. There has been a number of cases. And your BSE status is quite important in degree of trade. And only last year there was, and it's still ongoing, a big debate here because Australia decided to change its BSE position and allow imports where it can be demonstrated that these animals are not from infected, and the meat is not from infected animals. And this is a huge confidence building stream, and that was very controversial, and as yet no beef has come in. The first likely supplier of beef will be the Netherlands, who no one's ever heard of because it was always about Japan and Canada and the US. But it's only probably the EU has got the control systems in place to give the necessary assurances to the Australian government that these animals are free of BSE. And that's the sort of thing I actually do my work on. I don't normally do this sort of thing, but I work on access of European products into Australia. Where was I? I was got consumers' concerns.
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's fine. Consumer concerns. So we now got the social contract. The rural development measures were strengthened, and environmental measures. And here, the environmental measures, we're talking in part about stewardship payments, which are now in force here in Australia. Australia has in part copied what we're doing in Europe. In fact, only on Wednesday I was met with a senior person from the National Farmers Federation here who we just sent to Brussels to learn about the CAP and the reforms. And he came back and was staggered about the commonality about what we're trying to achieve. But we've done all that. We're now at the next stage, what we call the post-13 reforms. They're in the middle of those, and I'll come back to those. They're also known as the 2020 reforms. We love our jargon. So, something on across, well, the CAP is one of the oldest policy of the EU, and so it's very strongly rooted in the whole European integration project. In fact, if you go back in time, this is the current budget, put the CAP together, the two pillars, 41%. If you go back to 1985, it was 70% of the budget. If you go forward on the current estimates to 2020, it'll be 36%. So yes, it's the biggest of the expenditures, but it's very much declining. The other ones, the cohesion budget is about all our cohesion and our regional development and our social funds. And no doubt in other sessions we told about the importance, because these concepts of cohesion and solidarity are ingrained within the whole vision of what the European Union is about. You see other, that's all the, basically every other program, including my salary, are all in the 14%. That's all the external programs and everything else. So the CAP is expensive. It's 60 billion euro this year, 75 billion Australian dollars. That sounds huge, but it's also spread over 16 million people engaged in agriculture. There's about 300,000 in Australia. So the scales are completely different. But as you put it as a proportion of gross national income, it's declined from 0.61 to 0.31. That is very affordable when you compare that, say, with an average health budget, maybe 10–15% of the economy. So one of the points is the CAP, yes, it costs a lot, but it's quite affordable when you put it in perspective with other policies. So, a bit of explanation of some of the jargons, the bent and the pillars and everything else. So we have the first pillar, the market organisation, where you have the regimes for rice, sugar, cereals, wine, olive oil. Then we have these what we call direct payments. These are what are now decoupled from production. There are still some coupled payments still remaining, some headage payments still remaining. And I'm talking about the social contract. Well, they're called the cross-compliance standards. These are minimum basic standards, which may be animal welfare standards, they may be animal health standards, which have to be met to be able to receive the direct payments. And we have an audit system of 5% of farms each year are audited to see, and if you don't meet the audit, you can either deducted or disqualified. The second pillar, that's the rural policy. That has a number of areas. That's about structural adjustment, about some of the new member states came in were what we call semi-subsistence agriculture. There wasn't actually even market-based systems. So they had to be huge investments into modernising their structures. It's about, we have our environmental programs, our stewardship payments, our schemes to encourage people to put wetlands in. And it's also in there we have an element which is dealing with diversification out of agriculture, say farm-based recreation, tourism, about providing infrastructure for rural communities, about broadband to rural communities, childcare facilities are all funded through this. So this is not only, I say, about agriculture, it's very much about rural communities. In fact, if you go back about 3 years, there was a debate in Europe whether or not it should be renamed from the Common Agricultural Policy to the Common Rural Policy. So that's why I'm underlining that. It's not quite in vogue at the moment, but multifunctional agriculture was very much particularly during the Agenda 2000 discussions, where agriculture is not just about production of food and fibre. We now talk more about public goods which are produced as a byproduct of agriculture. Not only is it maintaining biodiversity, but just the landscape in Europe is being created because of agriculture, and that is very much valued by the population. In the UK, there's a place called the Lake District, which is a beautiful mountain region. Without the sheep grazing on high hills, it would be a very unpleasant place to be. So the agriculture has actually created this place where everyone wants to go to. And that is very much appreciated by the broader community in Europe. So it's not just about agriculture. And yes, agriculture is underpinning the whole rural community. Something like, my figure's a bit wobbly on this one, 65% of the population are in rural areas. So Europe is essentially a rural place. So and even if you live in a town, you have rural roots and a lot of affinity. Another jargon, modulation. Modulation is the term of moving money away from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. It's about transferring funds, so a way of increasing the emphasis. So under the present time, we're taking 4% a year away from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. It's jargon, but let's see what happens now. It still works. So we now move on to where we're going. We're in the middle of the process. We started 2008 with some informal exchanges. We had some informal consultation. The Commission issued a communication, which is equivalent of a white paper. In Australian terms, we had a formal consultation process. In between this, we had the EU budget proposal for what we call the next financial perspective, 2014 to 2020. And end of last year, we put out the formal legislative proposal. They go to many hundreds of pages. That is now, we're at the stage, the Commission makes proposals, and now the Council and the European Parliament debate and make the decisions. That's the process we're at now, and they need to make those decisions by the 1st of January 2014. So the whole process is going to be a process lasting 6 years to reform. So this is not a trivial process. And so part of the reason is some of the new, the context where it's being considered. First of all, agriculture now is in greater uncertainty than it's been for a long time, and partly due to this, what we could call a cost-driven commodity price boom. So agriculture is doing well at the moment, but it's struggling. If the price is coming down, it's struggling because the input costs have very much gone up, and so the future of agriculture is now largely out of its own hands. So it's a new set of dynamics. The new institutional setup following the Lisbon Treaty is very important. This is probably the biggest set of reforms that the Parliament will talk about, or have the role of co-decision, and one which I think both sides, from the Commission's point of view, is learning how to engage with the Parliament in this new role, and I think the Parliament has to learn about how to take the responsibilities it's now been given. So, because it has had sometimes, when it was just being consulted, some very maverick opinions, which is fine if you're just consulting, but if you're making decisions, you have to be a certain greater responsibility. So this is perhaps why the whole process has had to be extended to allow for that new decision-making process. And of course it fits in to broader things, the budget. And at the moment, the proposal on the table is for the CAP to be capped, just left as it is. But it's also, that's only a proposal. If the member states decide no, the CAP has to be reduced the budget, then what you can do in the matter of programs will have to be reconstrued. And everything at the moment is also considered amongst the broader EU 2020 strategy. This is the strategy of recovery from the economic crisis into what we call the smart, sustainable, inclusive growth for Europe. This is underpinning everything which is happening in Europe now, this strategy. They all go back to the 2020 strategy. And just the observation that whilst we have these new challenges, we've always met those challenges and managed to reform. Maybe not at the timelines which some people would like, but Europe's a very, not quite ugly, but it's not a very graceful decision-making process, but it gets there in the end. So, a little bit more onto what we're actually talking about, the challenges. Yeah. These challenges are not unique to us, to Europe. Australia is facing the same thing about this debate about food security, and it's been reflected here about a domestic debate on foreign investment. It's all really about food security. And part linked to food security is price variability. It's very difficult for small business to cope with price variability. and recovery from the economic crisis with cuts back is influencing all these things. So these economic challenges are all there. The environmental challenges, they're not new, but they're perhaps getting more acute as time goes on, as we've had a number of measures, but they haven't been sufficient. So greenhouse gas emissions, soil depletion, water air quality, habitats and biodiversity, all those are challenges which have to be met from intensification of agriculture and also the incursion from urban. So these are all issues which are not easy to address. And the last one's the territorial challenges, are really again about this inclusive growth and cohesion, about maintaining the vitality of rural areas and maintaining the diversity of EU agriculture. We don't want to see large tracts of monoculture. So from the challenges, we go to the policy objectives. This is the framework we're working through. Again, I say it's within the Europe 2020. So we're turning the economic challenge into the policy objective of viable food production. It's what we're trying to achieve in Europe. The environmental into sustainable management of natural resources and climate action. And territorial into balanced territorial development. And within all that, we're trying to make the CAP simple or simpler. It is hugely complex. I haven't touched on any of the complexity at all. But probably I've already bamboozled you with just some of the concepts, but it is very complicated, and so we're trying to simplify, easier to administer, and easy for people to understand. And then the legal proposals, we turn those into actually reform objectives, enhance competitiveness, improve the sustainability, and get greater effectiveness in delivery of the instruments. This next slide will be down one time, I can talk about, for this slide, for 20 minutes, so this is why I need to. So I'll just touch on some of the issues here. So these are actually when you get into the heart of this, and even me just getting into just to illustrate some of the things. So improved economic tools, where we're going to do away with the intervention in some of the products which we don't think is necessary, like durum wheat. We're going to make private storage vehicles very much just operating as and when it's needed without automatic triggers. So we're trying to weaken them so it's very much the safety net. We're also going to phase out, we have quotas on sugar. Sugar's a very controversial area for trade, and we're going to phase out our sugar quota system. We proposed it for 2015. These have to be agreed to. There's a debate here in Australia about the power of the supermarkets against that. That can be expressed as improved position of farmers in the food supply chain. And there's many ways you can do that. You can actually shorten the supply chain, direct marketing, farmers markets, direct sales through the internet. You can improve this by encouraging farmers to work collectively as cooperative. So the CAP is going to look to improve their positions in the marketplace, to get over that, to give them more of the value chains to producers. Anyone who comes from agriculture here will know that research underpins Australia's position. Australia's leader in research in agriculture, and we've already spent money on agriculture, but we are putting hugely more emphasis on the research, but particularly on the innovation. I mean, it's no good having research if it's not applied. So we're going to invest a lot more money into research as what's proposed. Sustainability. On these I might just touch on the first one, new green payment, to give you an illustration of some of our complexities. Under the direct payments, we're now going to say that 30% of the money any country has, which we always call a financial envelope, would have to be on green payments. These green payments, to qualify them, you might either have to have what's called permanent pasture, or have at least 3 crops in rotation, so it's not monoculture. And there's limits on what's the minimum, 70% is the maximum, 5% is the minimum to be counted. Or you have to have 7% of the total farm area set aside into ecological focused areas. So this could be a wetland, it could be hedges, it could be a small woodland area. All those will have made sort of measures which in the past you could get payments for under Pillar 2. Now we're saying, no, this is actually compulsory. If you're going to get, it's not something you get payment for doing something more. This is now base minimum. And if you don't get the green payment, you're going to have your other 70% discounted as well. So this is putting a bit of, it's still a carrot, but there's a stick to the carrot as well. So this is really trying to push people through. I think I'm going to keep going. So greater effectiveness. Redesigning the direct payments, we're going to have a new, what we're going to now call the basic payment scheme. And some of the issues we're doing here, at the moment the payments are unlimited. We're going to, it's been proposed before, but we're proposed again that there will be a maximum that any farmer can receive. And that maximum will be 300,000 euros less the wage bill on that property, which allows for, if you're a large property employing lots of people, that's taken into account. That is very controversial for the larger structured farms. So where I come from, the UK, they will be totally opposed to that. This has been proposed as the second or third time this capping has been proposed, and it's failed in the past. Obviously, they're also suggesting that if you're not an active farmer, you won't get a payment either. So what we call sofa farmers will be excluded. So these are people who just got blocks of land and don't do anything with it. We're also going to simplify it, so if you're a real small farmer, like 3 hectares, we've got 30% of the producers, farmers, have got less than 3 hectares. They're just going to get given somewhere between 500 and 1,000 euros, depending on, decided by the member states, regardless. So you just receive this, paperwork, it just disappears. So this is part of the simplification. So it's not a huge amount of money, but it's something which will reduce dramatically the administration. What is perhaps the most controversial of all the proposal is this redistribution of direct payments across and within member states. And this in part reflects that when the new member states came into the EU, they did not get the same level of direct payments as the old member states. And so what is proposed is a mechanism to get a transition so they come to the same level. And what we're talking about is having, first, it will be a flat rate per hectare set on a regional basis, and that should your rate be less than 90% of the average of the EU, under the current period, you will get 1/3 of the difference brought up over time. And then at the next 5-year period, we'll deal about actually reaching equality. So this is part of a transition to getting people at the same level. As soon as you start talking about redistributing money between people, it gets a little bit more focused. So that's that's just well, I could go for each little box and keep on going, but that's and interesting. Now we're talking about we're talking about some flexibility for the member states to move in both directions. So it's predominantly in more advanced member states will be moving money from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, but some of the newer member states may want to take money out of the rural development side and put it into the market side. So we're not being dogmatic. Again, when you're dealing with 27 countries, very different structures of agriculture, you can't have a single model which does everything. So there has to be flexibility, there has to be a pragmatic approach. It's not quite a la carte. Some of our policies, we talk about an a la carte approach, but here we have to include all the various positions. So now, so it's just just a few observations of what this has meant. Now, I'm not sure any of you know anything about trade policy in WTO terms, but in WTO we talk about amber box, blue box, and green box. Amber box is the most trade distorting support. Blue box is considered to be a transitional support, and green box is considered to be minimally trade distorting. Australia uses quite a lot of expenditure in green box. Sort of things which are included in there are, say, drought relief, research and development expenditure. That's all green box. And what basically the EU's done is moved from a position where all the support was predominantly in the most trade distorting support chariot reforms, we moved to a position where we're in that transitional phase, and now with our current position, and this is not, when you move forward, it will be even more green box, less amber, less residual blue, where it's minimally trade distorting. This is the reason why the CAP has really gone off the agenda as far as trade discussions are concerned about being so distorting, because we've no longer got trade distorting support. We've got one sort of support which other countries wish to give themselves. The degree of expenditure may be somewhat higher than other countries may have in mind, but this is very significant in that regard. And this graph, or the graph, is the simplest way why we're off the agenda. This is what's happened to export refunds, the subsidies which effectively dump our services on the world market. So go back to the 1990s, 10 billion euros a year we were spending on getting rid of our services. Now, under 400,000 in 2010, 400 million, and 2011, I can get the update, it will be less still. So we're just not in the world market in this way we were disposing our supplies, which leaves the world market then open to other traders to take advantage of the opportunities. And this is another way of expressing what's happening. I talked about us having structural surpluses, and huge structural surpluses. You see on week, nearly 35% of excess supply. So we're down to now 7% at the end of the noughties. With beef, we switched from nearly 10% structural surplus to being 4% net importers. So huge changes have resulted from these reforms. They've actually changed it. Look at sugar, where we were the world's largest sugar exporter, and now just slight net importers. So this is mammoth changes in our position in the world market. And we reflect that into WTO, what this means, and this is what you talk about with Australia, the impact it is within a WTO framework. We're talking about, we have offered, so at the beginning, the Doha negotiations for the World Trade Organization are stuck. Too many important general elections happening, particularly in the US, means we're not going anywhere at the present time. So this is an offer on the table. 80% cut in our bound domestic support, up to 70% cut in our tariffs, our bound tariffs. The word bound is very important. And phasing out those export subsidies permanently, as you see, we've virtually done it anyway. Now that's on the table as an offer. We won't do it, in some respects, particularly for large aspect, until there is an agreement. It's a card which is worth something for us to pay. Because we have 27 member states, getting those agreements on the reforms of the CAP are very difficult. So what we do, we reform the CAP first, then we make the offer to the WTO, which binds those reforms we made into, so we can't go backwards. Take another country like the US, the other major player. It has a single administration. It negotiates what it thinks is the best deal, then changes the farm bill. So a different approach, but it's more a reflection of our decision-making process. And you can be pretty well assured that if you've been through the rigorous process that we have, 27 member states, the outcome has a certain robustness to it. And it doesn't matter what policy this is. Our policy tends to stand up, and why we then pursue them. For those who are interested in this, there's a website which you can get lots of information from, all the outcomes, consultations, the communications, the impact assessments. There's thousands of pages of impact assessments, options, and sort of things, and legal proposals. And so, some apologies here to the new member states, because this was an old card from the 15 member states, but I think what it does show is that why the EU has the motto unity in diversity. So that's all I would say. Any questions?
Absolutely.
explaining.
Anyway, do you have any questions? Is there anything that you would like to have clarifications on? It's just very clear. Yeah.
Thanks, John. So under the market measures that presently exist, are there reserve price schemes that operate under this present CA?
Yes, I mean, there's still, the systems are still there, and in fact, one of the nuances we'll be making in the future is that they are very much now a safety net, and we're actually putting contingency funds away for those really severe emergencies. So we have there's a floor to the market, but that floor is very much at a very low level.
What are some of the industries that are supported by that?
Well, it's easier to say what is it. I mean, the intensive livestock doesn't happen because you have already on the cereals, so it's sort of built in that. But they have private storage aids though as well. So the Danes, who are probably the most efficient producers of pig meat in the world, there's a big debate here about the pig meat industry and the support it has. There's something called a PSE, a Producer Subsidy Equivalent, which is an OECD measure, the organisation, a Paris-based organisation for the developed economies, does these, and the EU has quite a high PSE for pig meat. That's only because it has an import protection, but the biggest export of pig meat in the world is the Danes, and are enormously successful, but that's the side as we are. Yes, and cereals, olive oil, milk. They're very much underpinning one. So essentially, all but the intensive livestock have convention systems. But it's now, say, on cereals, it's only on wheat. It's not in any other. Because what we're doing is picking the lead commodity within a group. Okay, so that price point is in the right place. The others, there tend to be a hierarchy, so they follow.
Thank you. I went to a lecture recently about the Euro crisis and finding ways out of the crisis, and it was an interesting approach because he was saying basically that a way out could possibly be a refocus on agriculture and what Europe does best, and I think you've backed that up. But we don't really hear much about that here in Australia. So I was wondering if that is being talked about at higher levels, about aside from IMF bailouts and all that kind of thing, if this could be more of a long-term
Well, I mean,
approach?
this is what the 2020 strategy is about, and it's not only for agriculture but for all industries, for us to reform them to be so we are that smart, intelligent, inclusive industries, and be able to. I mean, Europe is struggling at the moment, but there is confidence that we will work through the current crisis. We're already beginning to get off the front page, which is the main thing. Most of the crisis actually is all about confidence. It's a crisis of confidence. There are some real fundamental problems, but most of it is about confidence. So now agriculture has certainly a role to play, and some of the roles it could play. There is a very interesting debate going on because we are talking about a world which is rapidly growing, a debate about can we feed the world, and then there's well, how can you feed the world with the same amount of area or declining area, because there's always land being taken out of production for urbanisation. And you're doing that by saying, oh, we want more organic production, which is an important part in the choice of food, but it's not as productive. There are countries which are ruling out the GMO option, which is probably where the greatest productivity gains can come from in the future. So where Europe can actually earn money, though, is going further down its quality. We are hopeful that, for example, maybe next week there will be an announcement by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand to allow hard-boiled cheeses coming into Australia. and be produced in Australia. So the board considered it last week. We're hopeful there will be a positive decision. We're still working on the soft cheeses. They're much more complicated. And this is a human health issue. This is about E. coli and Listeria. These are real issues, but it's strange that in Europe we allow these cheeses to be eaten, but they can't be eaten here. And it's partly the Australian dairy industry here has been, could be called a pasteurisation mentality, which means by doing that you don't have to have the same level of on-farm hygiene. So they're right to be cautious, because the last thing you want is cheeses produced here on someone who hasn't got the hygiene, and then you do start having some problems with E. coli poisoning. So, but yes, the way we will go is high-value products rather than bulk.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just wondering about the European Union's policy then towards imported agricultural produce. If the EU and the CAP is about the quality rather than quantity, does that also apply to, say, the beef that's being imported into the European Union as well? Is it kept to the same strict guidelines as what's expected of producers in the EU?
Yes, I mean, our suppliers from outside are not too impressed at times about the amount of inspections they have, including here in Australia by our Food and Veterinary Office, to ensure that they're meeting our requirements. So imports have to meet the EU regulations, and on all food products it's all a matter of trust about the food chain. And so what you do, you inspect the system, you do a systems audit to ensure that it can deliver on food safety. So yes. Regarding the generic issue about sort of making it easier for imports, that's an issue for the WTO. Except for those countries we may negotiate an FTA with, which at the moment Australia isn't on the agenda for mutual agreement. We've both got totally full FTA agendas dealing with where the problems are, and that's with Asia. I mean, both Australia and the EU generally have very low tariff levels. In the past, you would say Australia had peaks in textile clothing, footwear, and in automotive, but they're down now to essentially 5%, except for one which is 10 in the textiles area, where we're still to change ours, because we don't quite have the same view about unilateral tariff liberalisation.
Well, I have one question. You talked about the two fields, which unfortunately we had looked at the Maastricht Treaty, and we had already encountered pillars, so it wasn't very general. If you talk about the need for the policy to have flexibility, obviously in Europe 27, you're talking about flexibility in terms of the shift, which for the older countries that had the benefits of the common agricultural policy, in its first phase, when it was very much post-peer oriented, the way I understood it all, to then moving on to Peer 2, but the new member state that still need to consolidate. So how does it work out in practice? This flexibility between allocating the resources more to one than the other?
Well, I'm giving that as an illustration where it could go, who's likely to go which direction. It will be up to each individual member state. They have financial envelopes. And it's how they allocate the financial envelopes.
So they are not, they make this decision as how they spend they allocate the money, are they Pillar 1 and Pillar 2?
Particularly regarding the direct payments, they don't have the scope within the market measurements. It's the direct payments, and again, there's issues like you can pay more money for young farmers, you can pay more money, a higher rate for young farmers, a higher rate for smaller producers. But that's a national decision whether or not they want to implement that.
But how, in terms of, if I understood right, in terms of actually encouraging certain countries to actually move more towards the rural development, a much broader agenda, how they encouraged to do it if the nation state regain ultimate control to how they allocate this?
states decide for their own circumstances. So whilst and times the special, sometimes to go back to the Pillar 1 maybe because of the greening of the direct payments. Now, as I indicated, that part of that payment for greening you could claim under Pillar 2 as well. We don't want people to claim twice. So you will have to discount what you pay. If you've received it already under Pillar 1, you won't receive it under Pillar 2. But you may, to fund that, you might move money across as an illustration. So these are things that are still to be worked out. You actually begin to now delve into detail, which is yet to be fully.
It's an incredible challenge for us to give that flexibility to match the different degrees of development of the member state, but at the same time keep an overall goal that eventually we all want everybody to reach that point.
Yes, and this is a dynamic. The last thing we want is actually to renationalise the CAP. But at the same time, we have to recognise that the structures are very different and the needs are different, and that's why we tend to use toolbox approaches. And not saying you must have this aid, and say currently, countries like the UK under its regional development side, it's virtually all spent on environmental programs, on stewardship payments, but the newer member states virtually are spending much more on that structural adjustment. So it's not being horses for courses.
Okay, any more questions or have we gone around? Okay, well we've learned a lot. I must admit, I think it might be a bit daunting, but I thought I understood everything and I have a better sense of what the common agricultural policy not only was, but has become and is becoming, which I think is important because we have to obviously challenge some of the deeply ingrained perceptions of the common agricultural policy that exist in this country in particular. So I think that was very informative. So please join me in thanking